Good morning.
Good morning.
It's wonderful to see all of you again. I appreciate the promotion. Last year I was the warm-up act for the keynote speaker. This year I get to be the opening act. I'll be honest. I asked for a little bit of direction. Well, what does it mean to be the first speaker every morning? And they said, one rule, the Kern Economics Summit, if you're the first speaker. Don't be boring. Now, I start every day of my life teaching 40 seniors AP macroeconomics. I guarantee you are an easier audience than they are in the second semester, no question about it. I also want to thank the people who organized this for this lovely advertisement. In the bottom right-hand corner there, it says I was backed by popular demand. I had friends, some people might call them haters, like Amanda Frank, who made fun of me for this, but I have to tell you, this really helped me in my relationship with my older brothers. Anybody who's the youngest child knows that no matter what you achieve as the youngest child, you don't know anything ever. So I screenshotted this, and whenever they gave me any grief, I said, hey, I'm backed by popular demand. So take that. So with that in mind, I wanted to give a very different kind of speech this year. So let's jump right on in there. Have you noticed lately that the most popular word in the English language, especially on social media and in media of all forms, is the word crisis? At any given time, we are suffering in this country from an environmental crisis, an economic crisis, an education crisis, a healthcare crisis, a national security. Come on, everybody. Crisis. I told you I could get you involved. You're already better than my first period class. Now, the reason why this bothers me so much is because it obscures the fundamental reality that the young people, the men and women who I spend every day with, some people might say I'm in the trenches of the culture, it obscures their view of life and the world itself. Because the reality is, the young people sitting in my classroom every day are, no questions asked, the luckiest human beings to ever walk the face of the planet. The information, the data, the research is overwhelming. As an example, fewer people in the world today are starving than at any other point in human history. Did you know that in the last 100 years, average IQ in the world has gone up by 30 points? Now, for those of you who think, well, that has to be a matter of genetics, consider this. Brains need calories. Probably not as many as I give my brain, but they need nutrition nonetheless. Not only that, extreme poverty is down by 60%. Do you know what happened yesterday, my friends? 137,000 people in the world rose above the poverty line. Do you know what happened 2 days ago? 137,000 people rose above the poverty line. And the day before, and the day before, every day for the last 25 years in the world, 137,000 people have risen above the poverty line. Arthur Brooks of the American Enterprise Institute says it is the best news that the world never hears about. When I was growing up, only 70% of the world had access to clean drinking water. Now that's 90%. Lifespans have doubled. In the United States, men can expect to live to almost 80 years old. I really appreciate this, by the way, because I'm 41 now. Okay, so I really appreciate that lifespans have doubled in this country. What about politics? 200 years ago, less than 1% of the world's population lived in democratic situations. Now that number is 2/3. Steven Pinker at Harvard has done voluminous research and has argued that we are actually, despite what you might see on your social media feed or in the nightly news, we are actually living through the most peaceful time in the history of our species. Time magazine has even gotten into it. One of the most extraordinary statistics I read was that the average American today has a higher quality of life than the richest man, John D. Rockefeller, had 100 years ago. So we Americans have this unique ability to bemoan our lives as we sit in air-conditioned houses, watching flat-screen TVs, doing research on our smartphones that have more power than the computers that got us to the moon. Now, why does this bother me so much? Because the young people sitting in our rooms, in my classroom every day, despite how wonderful and smart they are, generally have no idea how they became the luckiest human beings in history. In fact, I thought I was alone in this frustration until last year. I picked up a book by the most famous historian in America, David McCullough. And David McCullough tells of traveling around the country, talking to young people, and as he traveled more and more, he got more and more frustrated. As he says, the laws we live by, the freedoms we enjoy, the institutions that we take for granted, and we should never take for granted, are all the work of others who went before us. And to be indifferent to that isn't just to be ignorant, it's to be rude. Not to understand what gave us the extraordinary opportunities we have. Now, I don't get to travel around the world on a jet like David McCullough. I don't sell hundreds of thousands of books, I'm sad to say. But I want to tell you what moment came to me where I have made the same realization that our young people don't quite understand how lucky they are. I want to tell you about the first activity I do every year. On the first day of school, or the first day of class at CSUB, I project a series of images onto the front to find out if the students know who these people are. Right? So let's play along, shall we? I start with what I call the low-hanging fruit. You can interpret that however you want. But typically, 100% of young people know Kim Kardashian West. Mother of Northwest. Okay? Everybody knows her. But then, I put this up as a second picture. I know you all know it. Congratulations. Typically, only about 10% of my students can identify Mike Pence. About 10%. Now, then I want to make them feel good again, so I put up a picture of Beyonce, so they know who that is, of course. But then, I put this picture up. Now, his chief of staff is sitting right over there, and she's a former student of mine, so I actually changed my slide when I found out she was going to be here. Lord, you don't want to know. You don't even want to know how many people know the wonderful Vince Fong. Then, of course, I put this up, and the students say, well, is that you, Mr. Adams, from 10 years ago? I tell them yes, before I started feeding my brain so much food, right? But then, of course, what really saddens me, since I love the Supreme Court, is nobody can ever identify the Chief Justice or the most important judge in America, Anthony Kennedy. Now, this really came to a head in my life 3 years ago on what was probably the greatest night of my life, minus the birth of my children. You see, 3 years ago, Congressman Kevin McCarthy invited me to be his guest at the 2015 State of the Union. Now, that's the president in the bottom. I don't know if you know that. And then the red arrow is me. So I don't know if you could, just so you think I'm not making this up. Now, I'll get to why this was such a magical moment for me in a minute. I will tell you, though, despite the magical moment that I had here, and it was a lot of magical moments, the night did have its bumps, I have to be honest. I did get to go meet John Lewis, civil rights icon. I remember Congressman McCarthy had a friend. He said, this is my friend from Northern California. It was this woman I'd never seen before. We walk over, we meet John Lewis, and I'm kind of nervous, right, meeting a civil rights icon. And so I give this woman my phone, and I say, here's my iPhone, here's how you use it. She's like, well, I know how to use the iPhone. And so she takes a picture. A few minutes later, I take another picture, and I stupidly tell her again, here's how you use my phone. She goes, I know how to use it. We finish with the meet and greet. We go back to Congressman McCarthy's office. She leaves. The congressman walks up to me immediately and says, Jeremy, do you know who that woman was you kept telling how to use the iPhone? I said, no, who was that? He says, Steve Jobs' widow. What happened to transparent government, Kevin? Would have been nice to know that. Now, I wish I could tell you that things got a lot better. You have to understand, you take almost everything I love to teach, the institutions of American government, the Congress, the presidency, the Supreme Court. It was all there that evening. And when President Obama comes in, I lost it a little bit. Okay, I'm clapping, I'm bouncing. I'm probably going to break this, but I'm bouncing. I'm so excited. The lady next to me says, you are really excited. And I said, I'm overjoyed. So the president comes up to the podium, right? He waves to Michelle. He waves it to the center. And then he comes, and we make eye contact. And I am so over the top, out of control, he laughs at me. Now, if you don't believe me, I actually have video. Would you play the video of this? Watch. Oh, I got to go to the right slide here. Michelle, middle. Ah, right there. Right there. That's the president laughing at me. Now we live, my friends, in a cynical time, in an era that loves to constantly belittle, bicker, and insult. And yet on this night, I have to tell you, I was overcome with a mighty emotion that was more than simple inspiration, more than patriotism, more than the titillation of standing a few feet from the president, the Congress, and the entire Supreme Court. As I stood in the galleys of the United States House of Representatives, I have to tell you that I realized that I was standing in the stream of history itself. And not just any history. You see, I have visited historical places before, my friends. I have been to the courts of kings and the palaces of czars. I'm talking about something more substantial. On this night, this civics teacher was gazing at institutions whose task it is to preserve the most important aspiration in human history, the hope of universal human justice. It was our Congress that has proposed all 27 amendments that I teach. It is our president who has waged countless wars to keep the republic together. It is our Supreme Court who makes sure that our Constitution is more than just a piece of parchment, that our policies should never veer too far from our principles. On this night, it's true, I gazed in wonderment, and yet, I was a little bit saddened. You see, I wanted to take this magnificent moment and I wanted to bottle it up so that I could pour it over my students on the first day of class. You see, for so many of our young people, the magical melody of America is not a consonant song of infinite potential, but instead is a discordant history of unfulfilled promises and empty oratory. For them, there is no reason to bathe in these waters, no history worth knowing, no inspiration to be had. Of course, what they do not understand is that they did not become the luckiest human beings in history on accident. They are the healthiest, wealthiest, freest, most interconnected creatures on the history of the planet. My fear and what I'm trying to communicate to all of you today is this: the values, the institutions, and the behaviors that deliver these opportunities to our young people are not immune from decay. The famous historian Daniel Borstein once said, "Trying to plan for the future without knowing the past is like trying to plant cut flowers." And yet that is exactly what we are doing to an entire generation of young people who have no idea how they became as fortunate as they are. I can't explain to you how difficult it is to explain to them the people, the ideas, the triumphs, and the failures that came before them. So there are a few things all of us in this room need to do to prevent this and to improve things. First of all, let us stop assuming that history is inevitable. It's not. In fact, when you think about it, so many things in history could have gone differently. If the Greeks lose to the Persians at the Battle of Salamis in 480 BC, then democracy and science lose out to superstition and monarchy before they ever take root. What happens if Abraham Lincoln wins his senatorial election against Stephen Douglas in 1858? Did you know that in 1940, in FDR's third inaugural speech, I'll step out for a minute of my speech and just be a teacher. This is the most underappreciated inaugural speech, by the way. FDR's third, look it up. Back to my speech. In his third inaugural speech, he had to remind the world that while fascism was ascendant, it would never triumph over liberal democracy as long as we were willing to work for it. And what we really forget is how young the founding fathers were. We forget how much this country is an act of extemporaneous belief and action. If you forget that, by the way, look at the back of the $1 bill. It says, Novius Ordo Seclorum, a new order of the ages. Thomas Jefferson was only 33 when he wrote the Declaration of Independence. Hamilton was only 30. Neither of them were George Washington's first choices to be in the cabinet. He wanted John Jay to be Secretary of State, and he wanted Robert Morris to be Secretary of Treasury. The second thing we must do is we must push back, and I mean push back hard as a country and a community against the chic and fashionable idea that the forces of history and society always overwhelm the might and the inspiration of the individual. The most powerful idea in all of human history is a uniquely American idea. And that idea is that every man and woman, regardless of the circumstance of their birth, regardless of race, class, gender, or sexual orientation, is free of heart and mind, free to act, speak, and believe in accordance with one's inner convictions. We Americans are not subjects of a king. We are not mandatory members of an established church. We are not pawns of a feudal order that dictate how our lives will turn out before they've even begun. So yes, it is true. This is our creed as Americans. This is our civic religion. This is what Lincoln called the proposition of America. And it absolutely, positively is the exception to the rule of human history. Bondage, not liberty, is the rule. Poverty, not prosperity, has been the lot of mankind for thousands of years. Due process has far less prominence in the pages of history books than the writ of a king or the whim of a pharaoh. History is the story of Caesars and Kaisers and lords and pharaohs and warrior chiefs and kings and queens. So yes, for most of human history, The force of history did overwhelm the dreams and the aspirations of the individual, but not in America. You see, every year I meet hundreds of young Americans who know that they have individual liberty, but what they don't always have is individual belief. We must teach them that America is more than a place, more than an economy, more than a constitution. America is a spirit, and it's not natural. It has to be taught. It has to be cultivated. It has to be endlessly encouraged. Which brings me to the third and final thing we must do. I'm going to be honest. I hesitated before accepting this invitation this morning. I mean, think about it. Let's be honest. Who doesn't belong in this lineup? I don't have a PhD in economics. I don't have a PhD in finance. I'm not an entrepreneur. I don't run a business. I'm a public employee. You give me a check, I'll turn it over, sign it, and put it in my bank account. Right? That's what I would do. But the truth of the matter is, and I hate to admit this, the people sitting in this room have far more power and potential in sharing this spirit than I do. You are the entrepreneurs. You are the innovators. You are the creators, not me. Did you know that when Teddy Roosevelt was 22 years old, he was diagnosed with a heart condition, and he was told that he would have to live a very quiet and sedentary life? Well, being Teddy Roosevelt, he stood up, pointed at the doctor, and said, "Sir, I will do the exact opposite, even if it kills me when I'm young." Do you know why? Because that's not what Americans do. We are not critics. We are not observers. We go into the arena of life. We embrace the strenuous life. When we reach, we reach high. When we dream big. We don't hope, we aspire. And when we fail, which we all do, we don't claim victimhood as a reason for not trying anew. This is still the land where people in this country believe that hard work and self-belief gets you to where you want to be. 73% of Americans still believe this. Europeans don't. Our European friends, the average is 35%. Now, I love Europe, but I don't want to be European. If we allow our young people to believe that they don't have control of their lives, that they are victims of chance or pawns of history, then don't expect good things to continue. To conclude, I don't know what's going to inspire you to share this spirit with our young people. But I just want to end by telling you a story about what inspired me. It's a long time ago now, in college. Wish it wasn't that long ago, but it is. And I remember studying about the Second Continental Congress. And I remember reading that on June 7th, 1776, a man by the name of Richard Henry Lee stood up in the Second Continental Congress and said, "These states ought to be free and independent." That's the first time anybody had legally said so. For the next 3 weeks, the Second Continental Congress took part in this very rowdy debate, led by the Atlas of American Independence, John Adams, giving the greatest speech of his life on June 1st, 1776, and we all know what happened 3 days later. You know what I find awfully coincidental in my own life? On June 7th, 1976, another J. Adams was born. Now, I know that I'm in a room full of sophisticated, educated people, and I know that sophisticated people today don't talk about words like fate and destiny and providence. But I believe that sharing the spirit of this country has always been my fate, my task. John Adams once said, "I study politics and war so that my sons may study art and philosophy." Well, if this J. Adams may disagree with that J. Adams, we must never stop studying our politics and our principles. Because if we do, then don't expect America to be the exception to the rule of history for much longer. Thank you.